Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the credibility of sources. Next week, we're going to be looking at some events that occurred over the summer. You guys are going to be pulling in some videos and looking at some things that you may have seen or been interested in this past summer in current events. And we're going to be evaluating these sources in terms of credibility. So you need to pay attention here and be ready to apply some of these ideas next week. So, first, we need to be able to tell the difference between a primary source and a secondary source. A primary source is a record of events as they are first described, usually by people who were there and witnessed or participated in the event. Oftentimes, these are created at the time of the event, so it might be a police report on a car accident, it might be an original historical document like the Declaration of Independence, or something like that. But other times, it can be recorded years later by people who lived through it, but who didn't get a chance to write it down until they were older. So, for example, Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, is a memoir. She's talking about her life and in the past, not as it's occurring, right? Oral interviews often occur long after the events actually took place. One of the really good examples of this was in the 1930s. The government hired a bunch of people to go out and interview the slave generation, the people who were slaves in 1865 when the Civil War occurred. And they did this in the 1930s because now we're 70 years after slavery ended, and everybody was dying who had experienced this historical event. And they wanted to get some of this history recorded. Many of these people didn't read or write, many were poor. They needed to go out and reach these people and get their stories. And they did. And we now have this in our National Archives. So we have firsthand primary source examples of what people experienced during slavery. Um, Visual materials are also good primary sources. These can be things like photographs, although cautionary, with photographs, you have to be careful that you have some kind of documentation that the photograph is an original photograph. Because with Photoshop and things like that today, photographs can be very easily changed and doctored to not be at all representative of what they originally were. Official documents like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, those original copies. Posters like this one we have up here. This is from World War II, saying that women can work in the factories and do what men do, right? Those are all primary sources, firsthand or from the time of the event. Okay? Primary sources are opposed to secondary sources. Secondary sources are sources that are recorded by people who were not there. So these people who are recording the secondary sources generally go out and read a lot of primary sources. They're trying to get information from all different sides, and then they come together and try to create the story. So, for example, in an American history textbook, you're going to have historians who have gone out and read a lot and a lot and a lot of history, and they're going to try to take it from all different sides and make a story that we can understand years after it's occurred. Oftentimes, they're trying to analyze what they see in these primary sources. They're making interpretations of what happened in these events that can be true and sometimes could be way off. So, it's important to often go back to primary sources because secondary sources are not always universally true. Okay. By the way, neither are primary sources necessarily true. Okay. Oftentimes they are biased or from one person's point of view. And so you always have to keep that in mind that there's going to be a perspective or a point of view in anything that you read. Okay. So examples of secondary sources would be things like encyclopedias, textbooks, biographies, that sort of thing. Those are all secondary sources. Okay. So when we're looking at these sources, we're trying to decide whether these sources are credible. In other words, can we trust them? Can we believe in them? And those are the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at when we're looking at primary and secondary sources. When we're studying history, we have to analyze, are they trustworthy? Are they credible? Okay. And we're going to look at how we're going to do that. You have to really look at who wrote it, how it was written, what was the motivation behind writing it, what's the perspective. All of those things are things that we will be looking at here. So these things that I'm about to talk about here are the things that you will need to be applying next week. So you really need to be able to identify what are the various things we need to look at in primary and secondary sources to determine if they are credible or believable. So the first thing we're looking at is qualifications. We need to look at who wrote this document or book or whatever, whether it's a primary source or a secondary source. Is the person qualified to know what they're talking about? So if we went to read a book that Albert Einstein had written, that scientist up in the top right corner there, if we went to read a book that he had written and he was writing something about conservation of energy, we could say, yes, he probably is a very big expert in that area, and we could probably trust what he says, right? But if Albert Einstein were to write a book about marriage and relationships, maybe not, right? Does he have any more experience at marriage and relationships than anybody else? Just because he's a scientist and he has a good reputation as a scientist does not make him a marriage counselor, right? So those are the kinds of things that you have to be aware of. Does the person have qualifications in the field in which he or she is writing? Okay. Second thing, the circumstances in which the person is writing. Okay. Circumstances affect how you feel about things and what you write about and how you write them. What is the purpose and the motivation for writing? If somebody were to go out and write a speech for Donald Trump right now, this year in 2020, there's an election in 3 months. He wants to be reelected. So he's going to praise himself a lot, and he's going to say Biden is horrible, terrible, will destroy the United States, and never should be elected. Okay. Well, what do you think Biden is going to say? The same thing in reverse. Trump is terrible for America. He's done all of these horrible things, and this is what I will do differently, right? Is any of that necessarily true? Not necessarily, okay? Because they're trying to persuade you to a certain position. So that's the circumstances that you need to be careful, especially in politics. You have to be very careful about what people say, and you have to keep that in mind as you're saying it. Always be a critical reader. In the top right-hand corner, you have two very opposing points of view about how to go about the civil rights movement. If you had read Martin Luther King at the time, Martin Luther King was an adamant proposal of nonviolent protest. On the other side, Malcolm X was not. Malcolm X had no problem with using violence, at least in the beginning of his social protest. Okay, two very different perspectives as they're looking at this and circumstances in which they were writing. The circumstances for the two gentlemen at the bottom. On the left, you have W.E.B. Du Bois. On the right, you have Booker T. Washington. The circumstances of W.E.B. Du Bois' life is that he grew up in the North. He came from wealth. He was one of the first African Americans to go to an Ivy League college. Okay, he graduated from, I don't know, Harvard or Yale, one of those, right? On the other hand, on the other side, we have very different circumstances. Booker T. Washington was a slave. He grew up very poor. He grew up in slavery originally. The slavery ended when he was about 10 or 11 years old. So he experienced what slavery was like. He came from that kind of an environment. And so when he was working to fight for the rights of African Americans, he was approaching it from a very different perspective, from the perspective of someone who had actually experienced slavery, which W.E.B. Du Bois had not. And the two of them had very different perspectives, and they didn't really like the other person's point of view, either one of them. Okay, so circumstances make a big difference in the way that information is going to be presented to you. You have to keep that in mind. So another thing that you might look at is perspective. So when we're looking at perspective, we have to keep in mind that people, being human, all have certain opinions, biases, points of view, etc. And sometimes those opinions that they have about life can color what they write about. Okay, so for example, if someone is being very biased, in other words, if somebody writes an article about Donald Trump and they cannot come up with a single thing, not one single thing that Donald Trump has done correctly, there's a problem. Because as much as you might hate Donald Trump for a whole variety of reasons, there are some things that he has done that have been productive for the United States. So the same thing is true of Joe Biden. You could look at Joe Biden, you could say, if somebody came up with Joe Biden and said he is absolutely horrible, he would be the worst president ever, there is not a single thing the man has ever done that was useful to the United States. That's bias. And that cannot be true. There's never all of anything with, you have to look for a balance in people's writing. I've colored some of these terms here because you really do need to look for these things. So bias is a one-sided opinion. Perspective is a point of view. Stereotypes are generalizations made about an entire group of people. So for example, blondes are stupid. Okay, that's a stereotype that's been around for a long time. It's not true. We all know it's not true, and yet we still make jokes about it, right? Fat people are funny. That's been a stereotype that's been around for a long time. Okay, and it's not always true. Fat people are not always funny, but that's one of the stereotypes that exist. A relatively new stereotype that's being created is that children are constantly playing games. They don't play anymore. They don't do any physical activity. All those kids ever do is they're on their phones 24/7, right? Or playing games 24/7. So these are stereotypes, and you need to look for those because it points out that the author is not balancing what they're writing, and so therefore they might not be as credible as another source. Sources also need to be accurate and consistent. In other words, if they're making one statement at the beginning, then they should be making the same statement at the end, and the facts that they use should be supporting that idea. If they're presenting facts that do not support the thesis or the statement that they made at the beginning, then there's a consistency problem. Okay? If the facts they're using are wrong, that, like if somebody's lying, making up facts, that can also be a problem. So accuracy and consistency are things that you need to look at as you're reading newspaper articles, as you're watching, news reports, things like that. And you need to check and see, can these sources be verified by other sources that we accept as being credible? Are we seeing the same thing? That's actually a good thing because it's proving that it's the generally accepted truth about something. You know how you go and do a research project and you come up with, you're required to come up with 3 different sources and you look at them and they all say the same thing? I've heard multiple students complain about that over the years. But what that's really telling you is that your sources are consistent and therefore more credible. Okay, that's not a bad thing. And finally, we want the source that you're reading to agree with other sources that we have checked out and felt are credible. If you find that sources do not agree, it does not necessarily mean that it's wrong, but it means that you need to do further research and find out what is behind this strange opinion that doesn't agree with everybody else's opinions. Okay, so these are some of the things that you need to look at. You need to look at perspective, you need to look at accuracy, you need to look at agreement with other credible sources, you need to look at qualifications of the author. These are all things that you need to be looking for in primary and secondary sources as you are deciding if this source is credible or not. Thank you very much. Finish your notes and turn them in Google Classroom, please.